Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome to this month's ID Update. Very excitingly, we are actually live in all three locations, as intended, on time, and it all seems to be working. That's a first.
Fingers crossed. Now, knock on all the wood.
We're setting a low bar for today's stream. If it works, we're very, very happy. Welcome to possibly a slightly new format, I guess, to the ID Update.
We'll see.
If you remember, last month we discovered that we have a burning disagreement, a need to have an argument, and then fall out and never again do one of these shows.
Yes, no more. This is going to be the last show. Nobody knows it yet.
These are the stakes involved in this kind.
What happened between you and Tom? We just send him this link.
Just an hour of us falling out over something. That is. This question really is. It is tearing the industry apart. I can't sleep at night because of this conversation. So I feel like we really need to resolve it. For those who perhaps don't communicate predominantly through sarcasm, you'll probably pick up the fact of we are going to take on the debate or discussion that we spoke about last time, but we're certainly not going to fall out over it, which perhaps gives you some idea of how important we rate this particular debate in the grand scheme of things. But it is interesting, and sometimes interesting is enough. Certainly enough when we've got an hour to fill. Anyway, before we dive into that, I guess a couple of quick things. One, I forgot to ask when we first started the stream. Heidi, how are you? How's your month been?
Good. It's still summer, which is awesome, but it's now winding down, which is not awesome. I heard my son let out this blood curdling yell from the other room just a couple days ago. I was like, "What's wrong?" I went running, right? It was the kind of yell where I was like, he's gotten injured. And I opened the door and he goes, "I have to go back to school in 3 weeks." So yeah, that's where we're at in the household right now.
Love that. That's like me when I realised that between a contract gap, a new deadline date is about to come up, and it's like I've got to work again. I've got to try hard and talk to other people. No, that's never a nice realisation. Fantastic. I guess just to dive into kind of expectations for this show then, we're not going to do a formal debating format. So if anyone's got a particular rule set in mind that they're expecting to see played out, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. This is not going to be a collegiate exercise, but I do, for a long time, you've kind of heard both of us say at different points, we need to disagree about more stuff in our industry. Whether it's at conferences or networking events, when the whole room is just nodding along, completely agreeing with each other, lots of us are lying, And it doesn't mean that we think the person that we disagree with is an idiot or doing something, vehemently wrong. They're not evil. They're not kicking puppies, or suggesting the return of a badger cull like we're looking at in Wales at the minute. They're saying I might work slightly different to you within our professional field, and disagreeing on that and being able to discuss that disagreement should make us better at what we do, or at least allow us to make sure, am I as certain as I think I am? Um,
Sure.
who knows? Maybe one or both of us will completely change our minds, or maybe absolutely nothing will change. But we'll have an opportunity to air our views. But a good place to start then is maybe to air our views. See where do we stand
Sure.
on this particular topic? So Heidi, do you want to lay out your kind of starting position first?
Yeah, sure. I think also we should probably just define, for the sake of having a common definition, probably both media and modality, right? So when we're talking media, we're talking what exactly? Anything that is consumable?
I guess. I mean, and I think that this might be an interesting place for us to start, right? Because I understand why there is sometimes a preoccupation with really tight definitions on these words. But if anyone's ever read, I wrote a Substack article on this exact topic probably almost a year ago now, actually, and the opening paragraph is like, I do not care about these definitions. I'm going to use the word modality to talk about how we deliver training, and everything else can basically go sit in the corner for now, because I think otherwise we can get a bit lost. I think media, you're right to talk about media though, because media is a term that exists in so many different contexts. So like the media, as in the press, that's an easy, or
Right.
media as in, like multimedia, like, kind of, I guess, and then you have medium. Are they the same thing?
Right.
To what level do you split hairs? But for the sake of argument, yes, I would say when I'm talking about kind of modality or medium or whatever it might be, it is the vehicle or the format by which we deliver the intervention that we're talking about. So that would be my approach to it. But do you sit somewhere different on that?
So to oversimplify the hell out of it, the media is the what and the modality is the how.
Yeah,
we'll see if that
could
holds
go
up.
With that.
We'll see if it holds up. I don't know. It might, but we'll see.
we can explore that along the way as well, can't we?
Sure. So, unlike the AI image of us getting ready for our MMA fight suggests, I am actually on the Cosma side of the Clark and Cosma argument, where I am of the opinion that the modality matters and that the vehicle or the mechanism is just as important as the media itself, which I believe is the argument. Now, Clark's argument came before, so I'll let you go ahead and explain that side, because mine's like a little bit of it's almost like a response to. So I feel like probably you need to set up some of the Clark side of things.
Cool, let's do that. I did have a date written down, because I think, yeah, we go. So it might be useful to lay out some of the timeline pieces as well.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I didn't, when I first took this opinion, and this is probably useful insight because it's informed how I word some of it, I wasn't really aware of the research behind it. I came to I don't consider modality to be particularly important compared to other considerations. And I came to that just through basically trial and error and kind of observations in my own practice. And it was only once I started voicing that view that I was pointed towards the research that, as it turns out, at least from my reading, seemed to support my position. At least not completely. It helped me refine the position. But basically, it's the concept... Richard E. Clark, original piece 1983, and then expanded upon in 1994. So we're not talking about something, that's just arrived recently. This is basically the concept that you've probably all heard the delivery truck analogy, that modality is the delivery truck that's bringing you the thing. I often talk about it in terms of food. I need the food to be the right food. I need it to be fresh. I need it to be nutritionally of value. What it's delivered in, doesn't really matter so long as it's delivered with those three things intact. From a L&D training perspective, my view is that the modality we deliver something in is not the major contributor to its effectiveness, and that the underlying instruction, the experience we're creating, is not modality specific. Now, that doesn't mean that every experience can be delivered in every modality. I think that's often the kind of misattributed. Look, if you carry out any argument to the extremes, it falls apart, right? So I'm not saying that, if you need to train someone how to do CPR, a podcast is the way to go, because the modality doesn't matter, right? That's a very extreme version of the argument that I think that kind of falls apart. Instead, what we're saying is that figuring out what you're trying to get people to do, figuring out what they need to do that, is the important and the effective piece. The experience, basically, that you need them to go through is the impactful element. The modality through which it is delivered, generally, I would argue, certainly in my practice, is selected through, not so much through selection as removal. So the way I described it on our previous call was, in my head, I imagine all the ways you could deliver it, and as I'm designing, I'm crossing things off to see what I'm left with, not choosing one that I think is going to be more effective. And when inevitably I end up with 3 or 4 things left on the list that I could do, my ask is, so what's the most efficient one? What's the quickest to make and get into the hands of the user? Because if I can deliver it 3 or 4 ways, my stance is, my job is to fix this problem quickly, effectively, and with minimal resource taken from the business. That is so very short, very simplified.
Yeah. No, I think that was perfect. I think that was great. But I would then ask, as my first argument, whether or not efficiency then becomes an importance criteria that you're placing on the modality, which then makes the modality important.
But efficiency doesn't impact effectiveness, I would argue. It doesn't, whether or not it's efficient from an organizational perspective, i.e. cost as little as possible, can be done as quickly as possible, doesn't inherently change whether or not the training is effective. Like, training can be wildly effective but hugely inefficient. I would point you towards VR as a stereotypical example.
Okay.
I'm sure there's some incredibly efficient VR programs out there. I've just failed to find them despite looking very, very hard. So yeah, I think the two should always be considered, but they aren't interdependent. I think you can have ineffective training that can be delivered efficiently if you define efficiency as not having to be effective as well as being efficient as the business might measure it. I do my definition would be that that's cheap and quick, not efficient, but organizations often don't take those into account.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. I'm just still not convinced that efficiency doesn't somehow impact the effectiveness of it. Because you gave a good example of where training is still effective, but I would argue that it is effective in spite of in those situations rather than because of. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like there is a point where solid, good instructional design kind of wins out over a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And where it can then overtake the modality at some point. And that's why it ends up being effective, but not efficient. Right. Yeah. But I would argue that efficient, more the efficiency effectiveness ratio could be more interdependent.
So yeah, I guess that's almost kind of the point itself, is that good training, if genuinely well-designed instruction, should work, quote unquote, i.e. achieve its end goal, I want to say regardless of modality, because some modalities in certain contexts can be an absolute blocker to delivery. Prime example, good news, great instruction's been put into an e-learning. The users have no internet access. Well, shit. There's obvious kind of logistical blockers that sometimes take things off the list. But broadly speaking, I would argue that good instruction should be deliverable through multiple modalities without there being a distinct difference in the effectiveness. However, there might be a difference in the efficiency of delivery. This is also, I think, one of the reasons why I like the idea of clusters, which also then provide choice to the end user, where you say, hey, actually, this instruction will be effective regardless of how you take it. So we've provided it in 3 different ways. So depending on your personal context, i.e., I'm in the car a lot, here's a podcast. I'm sat at a desk, here's some e-learning or whatever, or whatever it might be. It's once you try and draw exact stories, it becomes very tricky. But if we're going to argue that the modality fundamentally changes the effectiveness of the training, then we're in a world where you can't offer clusters, because then you're saying some of you are getting more effective training than others. And then who do you give the less effective training to, and do you tell them? And how does that impact the effectiveness of training, because people are expecting it to be less? I think that's
interesting.
It's not only is it not necessarily supported, but it's also, I think, potentially quite dangerous for us to say the modality impacts effectiveness rather than impacts efficiency. Is my kind of thinking.
Interesting. So I think you're getting to like one of the outlier positions of Cosma, in the same way that you were kind of describing the outlier position of Clark, where it's like only one modality can be useful or is the most useful or, should be XYZ. But I think that actually your comment about choice supports Cosma's argument in that offering people multiple modalities for them to select the one that they believe will be the most effective it kind of brings this question of learning environment, right? And is the environment part of the modality? And I would argue that it is. And therefore, the modality through the environment becomes very important, because if you are like, if your thing is, it's good training is good training is good training is good training, because I'm going to bring up another thing in a minute, but no, I don't want to do it yet. But like, we have a live facilitator on the factory floor versus a live facilitator in a quiet conference room. That's, kind of say like, oh, well, the environment doesn't matter.
Yeah, no. So again, I think the trouble is that live facilitator is a modality choice. That's not a training choice, in my view. That's the delivery mechanism. So the instruction, the thought behind that, the instruction, we are going to deliver X, Y, and Z, and they're going to experience X, Y, and Z. Fine, no problem with that. That can be delivered, or rather, you would then look at the environment. I would say the environment, is not part of modality. It might limit your. This way, I focus on the limitations as opposed to trying to solve. So I would look at, what are we trying to achieve, and in what environment are we trying to achieve it? Because generally, this is almost wider than these now. I would argue that looking at environment in which people are doing the work and potentially trying to improve performance, we should be looking at that before we even decide that some form of instructional intervention is necessary. So that comes so far ahead. Because the first thing we're going to do is there an environmental fix to whatever the performance problem is, right? We're not going to jump straight to training. So we already have a concept of what those environmental factors are in terms of what's going on in the workplace, where are people doing the work, are there environmental factors impeding performance, etc., etc., etc. That's what's going to give us the insight to say, no, we shouldn't do anything on the factory floor. Or if we do have to do something on the factory floor, it can't be facilitated training, a podcast, a 3-hour e-learning, because if that is the environment, it will limit the modalities we can look to. But I would not argue that the environment is part of the modality itself.
I guess the part of this argument that I've always struggled with is I forget. I would have to go back and read the original documents. It's always been unclear to me whether the elimination of particular modalities, what you're talking about, like whose side that's technically on. because to me, that is like creating criteria around those modalities, which is placing importance on those modalities, which is like saying, like giving them a yes or no is like evaluating them, right? Which is thereby prioritizing them, thereby placing importance on them. And it's almost like the same way that you kind of go, okay, like how are we going to assess these people, right? And saying, well, well, it doesn't matter how we assess them, right? I think that when we try to find like metaphors, that's where it gets really messy.
Yeah.
But that's where the argument gets like fun for me, right? Because like I'm not fully convinced that I'm totally one side. And in the LinkedIn comments, there's a great comment from Lee Dale that says, if food is the analogy, I'd suggest a fork, a spoon, or knife is the modality, not the delivery truck, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, I guess
my first thought off of that, my first reaction off of that was, well, to a neurodivergent person, the spoon that you use matters greatly. There's like a whole like internet rabbit hole of sensory and autistic people that care very much about the spoon that they eat their food with. So I think especially too, once you get into, and I remember this specifically because we discussed Clark and Cosma during my PhD program, and 2 years before I was studying special ed, right? So accessibility was like in the front of my mind at the time. And I was like, well, wait a minute, when we bring accessibility in, does that change the conversation of whether or not modality matters? Can I guess your answer to that? Can I guess what you're going to say to that? You're going to say, well, if you have good accessibility from the beginning of your process, you don't have to worry about whether or not your modality is accessible or not. Is that your rebuttal?
That is the theoretical rebuttal. I think the trouble is that, and it's a bit like people say, oh, you should design everything with accessibility in mind from the very moment you start the project. That's a wonderful thing to say and excruciatingly difficult to do in the real world. And I think that's where a lot of the blurriness comes from, right? Because like my approach of modality selection through like basically saying what's left is not what the research says, it's my application of the kind of, between, this, right? You go from the research says to some kind of evidence-informed principles that you then figure out how am I going to apply that in a real-world workflow, because the real world doesn't go, well, here's the summary at the start, and then here's the findings, and then there's the conclusion, until you just do it that way all the time. So it's always a bit of a manipulation of whatever the stuff's found. The accessibility one is very difficult, and I think it's very difficult partially because there's so little really good, well-researched evidence about how it changes this. Like, both the Clark and the Cosma stuff is very heavy on evidence. It's very, at this point, it's pretty well researched. There's a lot of studies on there. We can look and go, okay, so beyond my opinion and my experience, here's what can be generalized. Accessibility, on the whole, currently suffers from a lack of really strong research. There's a lot of, and this isn't a dismissive comment, there is a lot of work based on experience, like lived experience, personal experience, and kind of survey-based inputs and crowdsourced information, which is fantastic, but it makes it very difficult to be like, this is a generalizable truth. Because as you say, the spoon example is a phenomenal example of like, there is no answer to that question. It's get 100 people and you'll get 100 different spoon requirements, which we as professionals cannot deliver on. And that's, I think, the really uncomfortable thing about our growing understanding of accessibility. More and more confirms to me it is impossible to provide a truly equally accessible experience to everyone. I think that
Can
kind
you hold
of thing
on
is
just a second?
Please, go for it.
You keep talking. I'll be right back.
No worries.
Sorry.
My point collectively there was, I think it's a wonderful, I don't know, North Star goal, but it is so far, in my view, so far beyond our current capability that it's not an operational reality day to day. And instead, we have to try and look for generalizable norms so that we can say we will deliver X, Y, and Z to the following levels. And that's where things like the W3 accessibility standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, play a really, really important role. Um, Unfortunately, in their current format, as has been the criticism for some time, they do relatively little for the kind of various kind of more cognitive, I guess, challenges people face. That it makes it very difficult to make a generalized point about something that is very poorly generalized, partially because we currently understand it so poorly. Maybe there will be an answer to that question, but right now I wouldn't want to be like, here is my answer, because my honest answer is, don't know. Like my stance is, we do our best. We try and agree an accessible standard, and we try. I will certainly say that there have been times when they've said here are known accessibility requirements for the people this is going out to, and that has immediately said no matter what we think, the following things are off the table, or the following things will have to be taken into account. What I try to not do is say, therefore, we must deliver it in X, Y, and Z modality. Because I think that, from the very start, by putting emphasis on that, you immediately limit what you can do in terms of thinking about the instruction. I think for me and my workflow, the importance is that the priority is given to what are we trying to achieve? What does the instruction need to look like? What do people need to go through in terms of the thinking and learning process? And then the practice process. And then we come to, and how might we deliver this? And just to cover the spoon versus fork versus truck for delivering food thing, I was thinking of food delivery. So like when they deliver our sort of fortnightly shop, they turn up in a van. My usual example is, I don't care if they bring it in an articulated lorry, a transit van, or a Mini Cooper, so long as it gets it. It was my thinking there. However, yes, if you're thinking of food delivery in your home, you could go spoon, fork, knife, chopsticks. Arguably, as long as the food goes into your mouth, you're good. But yeah, they do. All good. Sorry, that was a very long bit from me there. Where
No,
my
that's
answer
all
was
right.
basically, I don't know, about the accessibility stuff. But I would argue it is at least an inward looking and an attempt to be like self-insightful about the accessibility thing. It's just like, I don't know,
Yeah.
and I've not yet met anyone who, to their credit, I've not met anyone who claims to know either. Like, it does seem to be a bit like,
I don't know the answer either. I also think you've brought up like an interesting point about kind of like this, almost like this ick about the modality, right? Like coming first. And I think that like that reflexive ick is coming from vendors, right? Like I've been doing a lot of research lately on the negative effects that vendors have had on our industry.
Okay.
And a lot of that was my IDTX article for August, is based on how a lot of people in the L&D industry are using social media addiction metrics and calling it learning engagement. I know Lauren's watching, and I know she's gonna be like, yes, girl, because it's not like, it's like the cheap, tricky cognitive science that people are trying to, like, there's some LMS companies out there that have like, get your learners hooked as part of their messaging, right? And I think we've had this modality really pushed, right? Everything has to be an e-learning. 5 years ago, everything has to be a micro learning. If you don't have this micro learning platform, you're an idiot, right? Like everything has to be AR. I remember a great story from one of my good friends in the industry where they were trying to convince him as a consultant that it was a good idea to do their new hire onboarding as virtual reality when they were a brick and mortar. and everyone was on site. And he goes, why would you ever not just walk someone around the office and introduce them to the humans that they're going to be working with? Why would you do this as VR? Right. And now we have AI employees talking to each other, and people aren't even talking in the workplace. So I think I understand the kind of like, let's not put modality first, because it has been almost like forced on us, right? It's almost been kind of like everything has to be in e-learning. We still are getting the message of volume, right? Like the message of volume is like hurting me right now. Like we made 12 courses in a day. We made 15 courses in a week. We did 2,000 courses last quarter. Like no one is asking for these courses. Like this is where we can get a little more like it's traditional ID update, right? And say like, these messages, I think a lot of this messaging has complicated this debate, right?
Yeah. I would agree, and I wouldn't want to sit here and make out that there are two very cleanly like divided lines between if you do it this way you're wrong and this way you're right. As we kind of said at the start, like there's a lot of blurred lines here. Like, at what stage do you choose modality? There's no, there is no piece of research that I've ever read that supports one given moment to say that is the moment
Agreed.
where you do it. I think, and equally, even in projects. Like, I've been in projects where I've walked into a business and they've said, you're going to make e-learning.
Of course.
That's the project. Like that, I can sit there and go, well, Clark would tell you that. It's not going to make a difference. They want a piece of e-learning, and that's what they've hired the company to do. Sometimes that's the way it goes. I think the slightly more kind of, and this may be kind of the, what we were saying before about needing to reconcile research into practice is never simple. It's never easy. There's, one thing that comes up a lot, and maybe you can speak to this and sort of why it's the case, is that research papers very rarely end with, and if you're reading this as an instructional designer, here's how to reconcile these findings with your working processes. In fact, this might be a good kind of time to broaden this out a little bit. When we're looking at research like this, whether it's from Clark or Cosmo or any of these other people that have kind of done sort of meta-analysis on this afterwards, what should we be looking for from the research when we're thinking about our processes? How do we make those things useful? Because I would hope maybe some people might go away and go, I'm going to read up on this. I want to know more about this stuff. If not, what's wrong with you? What else have you got going on this evening?
It's Friday.
Read a couple of research papers.
Please.
Yeah, this is it. I don't have any other plans. That's how sad I am.
Right, exactly.
But if they were to go and do that, what does that process look like for you to be able to go from that to thinking about how am I going to use this?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I did when I was writing the article for the IDTX magazine that'll be out next month is I wanted to specifically find research that was outside of the L&D industry and then look at it through the lens of L&D. That was specifically because I've seen a lot. It's very interesting because when you ask, I asked AI for ideas. I was like, what am I going to write about? I got to give Tom this thing, right? I don't outsource my writing, but I was like, at least the ideas, right? Come on. It couldn't even do that. Come on. It was so bad. It was like all of these, it was giving, I was like, it has to be research based. And it was just giving me all these research reports from vendors. So I now know, right? I now know that my colleagues out on LinkedIn who are AI slopping it up are using research from other vendors, not even real scholarly research, right? They're not even using scholarly research at all. So one of the questions that I hope comes up out of this conversation is, where are we getting our information from, right? Where are we getting these ideas? Where are we getting these challenges? Where are we getting these criteria? Where are we getting these things that tell us that we have to use XYZ? If I see one more post that's like articulate and ADDIE equals instructional design, yay, I'm going to scream and throw my computer out the window. And then you guys aren't going to hear from me anymore. But like, I feel like we've lost the ability to have these nuanced conversations, and the result of that, and the ability to debate, like you were talking about earlier, and the ability to challenge one another, right? I literally watched a friend challenge someone else the other day to please explain their post. The person called him a troll and blocked him. It was like the gentlest, like, please, can you explain this? Because it's not making any sense to me. And it doesn't sound like L&D. And the person was like, you're just a troll. You troll everyone. And then blocked the person, right? It's become so unpopular to think about the work that we do and to take time to reflect. It's like we're moving forward at such a fast pace that nobody wants to slow down and think and consider and reflect and spend their Friday afternoon talking about media versus modality. And that's half the problem, because people are thinking of only storyline or rise as modality, that those are our only options. They've got these like vendor created blinders on, right? Like, this is the only kind of certification I can get in this industry. This is the only place where I can speak in this industry. And like, one big thing that I've found, because I got mad and almost left the industry, is that everything here is made up. Right? Everything is made up.
Moment there for everyone. Do you know what? Actually, it was really interesting. In a community, in the Learning Network community, actually, in the community Slack, well worth joining if you want some interesting conversations. Someone was asking about, I've got all these best practices about how to write tests and assessments. Without getting into the tests are not assessments, assessments are not tests. They're very different things, but that wasn't the point of their question. The point of their question was, what research, what evidence underpins all these best practice? So that when someone says, oh, well, that's just your opinion, what do I go back with? Yeah. And a lot of our industry is driven by these, often actually correct best practices. But when challenged or when presented with a context we're not familiar with, without understanding what underpins those best practices, we're going to really struggle to adapt what we think we know to different situations, or to justify how we work. So why is it important to test in X, Y, and Z pattern in this particular scenario? In what ways is an assessment different to a test, and why are they not the same thing? Why is that 10 multiple choice questions at the end of that quiz not good, but scattering these multiple choice questions throughout this learning experience good? What's the difference? So you're just moving where they are. That doesn't matter, surely. Prove it. Says who? And I think sometimes that's the value of these debates. And it's something that I really realised when I started writing on Substack. Because what happened really quickly was that I would write things, people would disagree with me, and they would say so. And it was freaking magical. Like, I have never, I don't think, thought so deeply about my own practice and my own understanding of what I was doing as when I was being publicly challenged in comments or getting messages going, I just read this. Is that what you meant by this? Because I think this, and I think that. It was so useful. And I would argue maybe not learnt more in the raw sense, but I think I probably became much more certain or changed some of my long-held approaches to work more so through that than through any course or conference I've ever been on.
So you just proved that modality matters, is what you did, Tom, by saying
no,
that it was through your writing modality that you published.
That's not
that you learned.
That's not a piece of training. Though, that's not a deliberate intervention. I feel like somehow this has been. I'm not going to say deliberately taken out of context, but.
I'm pulling that quote for the YouTube short and being like, Tom, proving my argument.
And the thing is, I'm not going to sit here and say modality is irrelevant. Like, that would be, again, an argument taken to extremists, right? That would be, well, in which case, just everything should be a book. Would be the logical at the end of that, right? Far cheaper than e-learning by a ridiculous amount.
True. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
We
Yeah.
would
We
just write
can
everything
create
down.
books way faster than e-learning.
Yeah.
12 e-learning in a day, I can make 50 books in a day.
Well, if you're making an e-learning in a day, there might be another problem with that. But you know what I mean. Like we would never have advanced from it's a book, chill out, or more probably realistically, if that was true, we'd still have wax tablets and scrolls, because we'd have gone. This is the perfect way to deliver training, which is all we ever really need to do. So, yeah, I don't like there. I think there this argument. I think interestingly, I think it only really looks at the idea of formalized training. I don't think the same things are applicable to learning more broadly. That's quite an interesting example, because I think the minute you look at, for instance, social learning programs, I don't think any of this discussion applies, because you're in a world where you could argue. I could see the argument much more for environment to that point supersedes everything. If you set up an environment that allows people to communicate, exchange ideas, etc., 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 social learning will happen. And actually, the intent of the L&D team maybe isn't irrelevant, but takes a much deeper backseat. So I think
I also am interested in what Clark and Cosmo would say today. After the advent of social media and AI especially, how they would, if they would, change their argument. Because I think you're right, like modality back then was much narrower than it is today, right? Like if you think of, I sometimes think of like my ancestors, like my like 5 greats grandmother, right? Because my family is very into genealogy and I know her name. And so I often think of Grandma Ava and like what she would think of like the fact that I'm riding around in a car with my dog in the back seat and working by like typing buttons all day. And I often like just think about that and think of like, wow, imagine if my, great grandma walked in right now and saw what we're up to. We're communicating with people all over the world. That was not possible in 1994 the way it is now, when this argument was kind of first created.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I'm not sure if my proposed answer might be, I don't think anything's really changed in the world of formal learning. Because formal learning at its core is still, we have decided that you need to be able to do the following thing in the workplace. Here is the observable gap between what you're currently doing and what we want you to do. Here is the intervention we have decided is going to fix that, and we will now deliver it to you. Where I think everything has changed is social learning concepts. Non-formal learning, i.e. the stuff we do that is not prescribed to us by someone. So for instance, I think if you're an L&D team trying to get people to self-direct, I think today modality becomes more important, because it's almost more of a marketing effect than it is a learning effectiveness effect, right? Persuading someone to go, I'm going to do some training, is less about the effectiveness of the training and more about, can you get them to buy into wanting to go through a piece of content often.
Sure. I think the other thing that you're kind of surfacing here is that modality matters less for you as a practitioner because you're doing all the right steps. Like you have the foundational knowledge and you are laying the right groundwork and foundation. So you are, by setting all of those things up correctly, like the needs analysis and the accessibility and the environment and the way that you just practice, because you are able to do process of elimination, because you do have that skill set, right? That it matters less to you because of your approach. And I guess why I try to put more emphasis on it is because of that kind of singular minded modality of everything has to be in e-learning that I see so often. Yeah. I don't know.
See, the reason I find that
it was just a thought I had.
No, do you know what? I had never really thought about like, and I'm gonna use an unfair and generalized word, but what if the person doing the instructional design, doing the work, isn't entirely competent? At that point, does modality, if we were able to observe this in a reasonable way, does modality matter more? God, because some modalities are undeniably harder to deliver well than others, and I would
That's
argue
true
like
too.
e-learning, I always think is quite forgiving, in that
Yeah.
you can kind of just bolt on and get around stuff. Whereas, for instance, trying to create like a highly effective workshop, especially if it's a short
Yeah.
workshop, I always think takes much more effort than a piece of
Yeah.
e-learning.
I would
And
agree.
other people disagree with that. I know they will because I've had the argument with them before. It's just my observation from my work is that I would much rather write a piece of e-learning if I want an easy day than try and build a workshop. Um, that's it's not really a good thing, but hey hum. Um, do you know, I'd never even considered that because all the research, of course, is going to say, doing all the right things. What because I guess that's the only way really to isolate the impact of any one thing is to assume everything's being done right, and then to say, so if we change that one thing, does it matter? But God, so there's a call out. We need some research done on what if the ID's not doing their job properly. Then does it?
Right.
Oh, because I think in that context you might be right. I suspect it would have a bigger impact.
And I found, so just anecdotally, I found when
Mm.
we were having this debate in school that people who were doing the work tended to side more with Cosma than Clark. And I can't help but wonder if it's because we saw our peers and how they were doing things. And the people who were just studying were very theoretical and hypothetical, and everything was like happy path, right?
That's interesting. Hmm.
So if everything else is good, then yeah, modality doesn't matter. But the reality is that mostly everything else is not good. And I wanted to go back to something else too, because I forgot it and then I remembered it again. Was the delivery truck metaphor? Because I was thinking about Amazon and how they've changed over a lot of their vehicles to electric for whatever business reason. And I was thinking about, well, Amazon would disagree that delivery method. And then I thought, okay, so if the organization that you're working for, if they have their particular opinion about the modality and requirements even, right, like technical actual requirements, then shouldn't that be important too?
So again, it's important too with my argument. So that the core of my argument is that and I'll use the delivery truck example. Do I still get my package? Because if so, they're just as effective as each other. Now, one may be wildly more efficient because they're going to claim EV credits for having electric vans and all that kind
Of
of
course.
jazz.
Sure.
But from the end user's perspective, if I get my package, then the blimp is just as effective as the electric van and just as effective as the petrol van. And I think it's the same from a training perspective. Like from an end user's perspective, if I do a piece of training, the actually important thing is that I am enabled to do my job in a competent fashion. Or perform in whatever way the organization is trying to get me to perform. Now, what we want to be in a world of is that's the important thing. And whether I get that from a podcast, a lecture, an e-learning, whatever, is an irrelevance to the effectiveness. However, is it more efficient to deliver in a 15-minute podcast versus a 45-minute e-learning? If you can do it just as effectively, then yes. But efficiency is not necessarily the same as effectiveness of the training. But that doesn't mean it's not important, because that's an organizational constraint, right?
Sure. Well, and I wonder too, I mean, not directly, no, but indirectly, does it have an effect on the end learning? Because then could you also argue that, because I've seen this happen too, that because I get what you're saying, but I think there are outlier situations where, like, for
Certainly
instance, a company is mandating something that has to be, for instance, an ILT. And if they try to give you a video, now your reputation as the L&D team. So I guess another thing is perspective, right? Like, you're looking at it purely from the end user perspective, where I'm more taking of like end user plus instructional designer perspective, right? Like, looking at it kind of from both perspectives of like, how can I continue to create effective training and effective learning? Not just, is it effective on the end, at the end point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you do always have to look at the full process, and you have to look at it from the business side of things as well. Which is why I'd always say it's kind of why there's. I tend to separate like considerations into a couple of different pools, but the big ones are the kind of designing an effective instructional experience, which is entirely standalone to modality, business stuff. Like, in terms of raw instruction, what should we try and deliver? And then the constraints around that become the environmental constraints, remodality, the business constraints, remodality. But the business should never be constraining, again, assuming you're working well, should never be constraining the instructional intent. And I think that's where I end up at my selection through sort of crossing things off the list, because I'm sitting there going, well, it can't be that, and it can't be that, and it can't be that. I would love to deliver this as a series of 1-hour lectures, which everyone goes, you can't do that, it's 2026. And they'll go, there is a reason lectures are still used. It's because they're really freaking effective if they're good lectures. The problem is, most of us have sat through terrible lectures. Which is fine. That's the way of the world. Same as most e-learning is awful. I know, because I've built loads of it.
90%.
That's, so yeah, that's kind of where I end up there. You can't ignore those organizational requirements and limitations, but I do think it helps us sometimes to say, I know we've got to deal with those, but they shouldn't, and you have to assess that case by case, be impacting the instructional intent. We should still be understanding what's the gap, how are we intending to bridge the gap, what is the knowledge, what's the skill, what's the practice we need to put in place here, then asking, how are we able to deliver this? And that's the question that leads me to the modality portion of the conversation.
Sure.
But I would never say, as we said at the start, that is what everyone should do. That is what I do.
Sure. Yeah.
In the same way that I love to use Post-it notes scattered all over my office wall, that works for me. Would I advise it for other people? No, because I have seen other people try and pick up my projects before, and it's horrible for them. And because that's a consideration, right? I'm very lucky to be able to say, in my business, this is how we will work. So when IDs join me on a project, they have to work the way that I say we're going to do the project. If you work inside a business, you might have the same principles that I'm working to, but the reality of your context might mean that you need to do this bit and then have this conversation and then take into account that, then have that, and then look at, it's not a case of right or wrong. And I don't think, and I'll shut up in a minute because we're nearly out of time, but I don't think Cosmo has no valid points. Like, I think ultimately this all becomes a bit of a conversation about what do you prioritize in your process. And how do you make, my view is that it's how do I make sure that my default does not just become, we're going to build a this, or I'm very excited about podcasts at the moment, so I'm going to make everything a podcast. My solution to that is to say modality down the road, instruction first, because that's what we have good evidence to say drives the effectiveness of training interventions. Whereas modality, UDL, all that sort of stuff, we have anecdotal evidence, but far less solid proof that it has a measurable and reliable impact. And with that, I will shut up and hand over to you to make your points, because I know I've been going for a while.
No, that's fine. I think there are some good questions that have come up. There's a question on YouTube from Laura that says, what if my ice cream is delivered via bicycle in Phoenix in the summer? And I think I know what your answer would be to that. What?
That's a prime example of that. Is you've kind of ignored environmental considerations when choosing modality.
Right. That's what I was gonna. You said at the
yeah.
beginning it has to, like, the food has to meet the certain criteria. So I'm assuming that one of your criteria is that frozen food has to stay frozen.
Yeah.
Right.
This is it. Like, it doesn't change. Again, and this is where the kind of the metaphors are difficult to work with, because you can always find a way around a metaphor. But certainly from a learning perspective, that would be the example of, well, we're going to do a podcast on the machine shop floor. And everyone goes, well, that's stupid, isn't it? Why would you that's not even someone has fundamentally failed to even think before they've just shipped something as something they care about. So I always feel like modalities play a massive role at the extremes. If there's no internet access, don't build an e-learning. If you've got an audience of deaf people, don't do a podcast. It's not, those are not, I won't say they're not serious considerations, but no one who is even approaching competence in what they're doing should be making those kinds of decisions.
Sure. I like the other question on LinkedIn too, that Simon asked. He said, does modality have moral dimensions, stick versus carrot?
Ooh. What do you think?
I don't know if that is relevant to the debate at hand. Should it be? For me, it's question. Not.
So,
and maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. But for me, for me, morality is too inherent. Maybe.
So I think that, and
I
think morality is very personal.
Yes, personal, and I think that there's such a spectrum nowadays.
But I do, focusing on the carrot and stick thing, I do think part of the environmental factors to consider is the perception of your department and your work in the business. And I'll be straight up now, I am at this point a million miles away from research. This is based purely on thinking, and not particularly deep thinking either at this stage, I'll be honest. I think it is always worth understanding your audience, because if your audience despises, like with a burning passion, the workshops that you have historically delivered, you should probably not deliver any more workshops at the current time until you have made significant and fundamental changes to them. I do think that's a bit of an extreme example, but we've all probably had come across stuff like this. I don't think modalities have an inherent sort of carrot and stick relationship with the audience. I think they can develop over time. Prime example, email. Email across the whole, like generalized, I think most people have a negative view of getting an email from HR. HR never email you to go, we're just checking in to make sure you are loving your job. No. You have not completed the following. You have failed to do this. You have been summoned to a meeting. Please bring a representative of X, Y, and Z union. It's, there is I'm not informed, and I'm not a philosophy person. I occasionally dabble in reading it, quickly realize I'm out of my depth and put the book down. But I'm not sure if it's moral, but I do think there can be positive and negative attachment to modality over time, but I don't think it's inherent to the modality. I think it is environmental. I think it's what you make of it in your organization. And I think you can change it if you take deliberate action to change it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's fixed, certainly. But that I do think I've been thinking recently, I think there are a lot more moral and potentially ethical considerations in the training world than we often think there are.
I agree with that.
But I also think we are incredibly unqualified to become ethicists and moral philosophers.
I also agree with that as well.
So it's kind of like, that's really important, but I do not know enough to take a meaningful stance on any of it. would be my
Yeah.
answer. Did we have anything else in the chat? Because I'm aware that we're at time.
I don't think, no, not that I can see.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you all so much to thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, I think that I don't think there's a winner necessarily.
I feel like the winner is having these conversations. The win is having these conversations, right? Like, seriously, because not enough people are. Too many people are going, AI isn't taking instructional design jobs. Someone doing AI is, with 5 to 7 hashtags at the end. Oh my gosh, give me a break, please.
Speaking of my next LinkedIn post, it's all about how AI. No. So look at that. The what was it? The treasure was the friends you made along the way. That was still one, isn't it? But no, I think this is exactly it. Like, the opportunity to sit down and chat through ideas with peers is so important. Whether you do it in person or on a Zoom call or publicly on the internet, I think it's time well spent. And hopefully there are questions that you've now got at home listening to this that you might go and have a think about or research, and let us know in the comments as well. Whether you agree, fervently disagree, think we've overlooked something fundamental, please do leave that here. There is nothing better than getting challenge and pushback that allows you to think more deeply about these things. We will, I think, we'll be back next month. I don't know what we're going to do next month yet, but we will come up with something, and you will see it, because I'm always late, probably about a week or less before next month's live stream, when you'll have to quickly scramble to find out what we're doing.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Brilliant. So just before we go then, anything you've got coming up in the next month, Heidi, that you'd like to share with everyone?
Not that I know of right now, because my God, next month is August and it's back to school. So over to you, Tom.
This is one of those times of year where I sit here and go, oh, I've not got kids. It's so terrible. It's awful. I mean, all this, what would I do with all this time?
It's so much. It's so much. Yeah.
So on the 5th, I'm doing a webinar with the Digital Learning Institute on the science of storytelling. Really exciting. We're going to go back as far as cave paintings, the earliest form of training, arguably, or certainly recorded training, and looking at maybe not what we can quite learn from cavemen, though there probably is some stuff, to be honest. We could learn a lot from them about our use of AI, I think. But we could certainly learn a lot about why stories work. Again, that idea of understanding the underpinnings of best practice rather than just, this is the hero's journey, which doesn't work well for training anyway. And then later in the month, of course, we'll be back for another of these ID updates. Please do subscribe to whichever version of the place that you're watching this, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, or Substack, and consider dropping us a line if there's something you'd like to see us discussing in future. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again next month.